Okay, I think we are underway. Everybody should see this first screen, God is Good. That's the name of the course that we've been doing. And tonight's session, let me move to the next page, is the Exodus and Moses Part 2. We started last week, the first part of Exodus, the beginnings of the Exodus and what led up to it and so on and so forth. And I threw in this slide just to remind people, I don't think I've remembered to do this each week, but if questions come to your mind, either or comments during the talk or afterwards during the week when you're reading into the next or whatever, whenever it comes to you, feel free to email those to me or text them or whatever's your easiest way. And we can deal with them at the next session. So I apologize for not making that clear. I usually talk about you can use the chat button during the session, but I generally haven't thought to remember or mention that you can always do it after the fact by email too. Okay, this is sort of introductory thought for tonight. We've been watching God do all kinds of things. And in the beginning, the period of time that the Torah is being written and these stories are happening, God is very active in interacting with the world, intervening with particular people, and so on and so forth. So in a way, and he isn't nearly that, or at least apparently isn't nearly that active or directly involved with these days. You know, we don't see this sort of miracle after miracle, event after event happen. So the question arises: what if God revealed Himself at the Super Bowl one year? Would that make any difference, do you think? Prager pondered that for a little bit, and finally came to the conclusion, and I probably agree with him, that it really wouldn't have that much effect. Probably those who believe will continue to believe. Those who don't believe will dismiss it as some sort of special effect. I mean, after all, look, and even if somebody does think it's interesting or somewhat awe-inspiring or maybe perhaps divine, they'll forget about it in a month. Look at the Israelites. They gave up on God. They went to golden idols out in the wilderness just after seeing God liberate them from Egypt, send all those plagues, part the Red Sea. So it is pretty clear in the biblical stories anyway that even miracle after miracle on a relatively frequent basis doesn't really do the job. Other things get in the way, whether it's human nature or human suffering or human tendency to not remember things. It just doesn't matter. And another thought that he had was if God revealed Himself in a 100% can't argue with it manner, then we really wouldn't be free to believe. Freedom to believe would basically go away. The bottom line is God is only reachable through belief, I think, is kind of what it comes down to. But it's an interesting thought game. What if God revealed Himself at a Super Bowl? Okay, summary. The plagues, we're going to enter the story here at the 10th plague. We basically skipped talking about all of the other plagues in detail, but so we don't miss it. The purpose of the plagues is basically threefold. One is obviously force the release of Israel, basically convince Pharaoh and his minions to let the people go. Another purpose of the plagues is actually to punish Pharaoh and the Egyptians. If God is anything, He is a just God, preoccupied or obsessed with justice. So he would want to make sure that the Pharaoh and Egyptians got theirs, quote unquote. And the third thing is, and this falls right in line with what the Torah has been trying to do all along. One of the main objectives of the Torah is to convince the people of the day that He is the one true, the one moral God, that all the paganism, all the polytheism that's going on, and that's what was the religion of the day, so to speak. Pretty much all these ancient peoples were paganists. That He was the one true God, and all these other pagan gods, gods of nature and so on and so forth, were nothing. So, interestingly enough, with all the plagues, he was picking on Egyptian nature gods. There was a god of the locusts, there was the god of the frogs, there was the god of the Nile when he turned to blood. He was picking on, I'd say God was picking on all the nature gods of the Egyptians and showing them, in essence, who was really in charge. So each one of those first 9 plagues was aimed at one of the Egyptian nature gods. The 10th plague, which we're going to talk about tonight, the killing of all the firstborn of Egypt, was aimed at all the other gods. Speaking of killing all the firstborns of Egypt, raises another interesting kind of bigger question. Is it possible to have collective guilt? In other words, was it fair to punish all of Egypt for the evil done by Pharaoh and whoever supported him? Is there such a thing, or can there be such a thing as collective guilt? Prager's answer to that question is yes. He says, or argues, it took all the Egyptians, or at least a preponderance of the Egyptians, to let or make 400 years of slavery happen. It's not just to deny national level evil or evil by a nation simply because a few people didn't participate. It's probably it just can't be done. American slavery, for instance, he would argue too, was a nationally committed sin, or we were nationally guilty for that. And 700,000 people paid the price in the Civil War to fix that. And then it really wasn't even, quote unquote, finished at that point either. It took another, almost 100 years to turn the remaining tide during the civil rights movement of the 60s and so on. So yes, there can be national guilt, or I should say collective guilt, and certainly, at least in God's eyes anyway, that was the case here in Egypt. Chapter 11, verse 1, and the Lord said to Moses, I will bring but one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. After that he shall let you go from here. Indeed, when he lets you go, he will drive you out of here, one and all. A couple of things to note here. The word I that starts this out. This is unique among the previous 9 plagues. God is taking full responsibility for this one. He is the only one accountable. He doesn't have Moses raise his rod. He doesn't call upon winds or lightning or dust or anything else. God alone is taking charge and full responsibility here. Another interesting thing to note that it will be Pharaoh who lets them go. In fact, it will be Pharaoh who drives the Israelites out, as it says at the tail end of this verse. He will drive you out of here, one and all. When this plague is over, he will do everything in his power, Pharaoh, to get the Israelites out of Egypt. In the second verse, tell the people to borrow, each man from his neighbor and each woman from hers, objects of silver and gold. There's a number of interesting things in this little verse. One of the interesting things is, in the translation in the English, it completely drops a word that is there in the original Hebrew. And that is the word please. God is talking to Moses here. God says, tell the people to borrow. In the literal translation, what God literally said was, please tell the people, ... There's a lesson here for people in authority. Saying please preserves dignity. It enables the lesser person to feel more like a partner than a servant or an employee. Even in this case, I mean, it's like Moses was going to disagree. No, but even so, please is a good thing to do. So what about the word borrow? They're about to leave Egypt, right? And they're going to return it later. Probably not. And we're talking about silver and gold here too, things of great value. The Hebrew verb that's used here is pretty ambiguous. It could be ask for it. It could be borrow in the sense that you would hope to return it anyway. But even if it would be translated borrow, it could be borrow in the sense that someone might say, could I borrow a cigarette? Or could I borrow a tissue? There clearly isn't any intention of returning either one of those, or certainly no desirability of having either one of those returned. So it could be like that too. In any case, there's virtually no chance that whatever wealth is given to the Jews by the Egyptians is going to be returned. So why would God ask the Jews to do this? Why? Well, one possible answer is it could be perceived as basically severance pay or compensation for the 400 years of slavery that the Jews have gone through without pay. This is their pay on leaving town, so to speak. It could just simply be a punishment to Egypt too, that taking away most or at least a good deal of their wealth. Ironically, however, this is the silver and gold with which the golden calf will be built with out in the wilderness. And in fact, in some way, God having the Jews ask for, the Israelites ask for this from the Egyptians is kind of setting them up so that even making a golden calf is even possible. Another interesting thought. So in the remaining verses of chapter 11, started out with, Moses said, thus says the Lord, toward midnight I will go forth among the Egyptians. And again, Moses reiterates it's only God that's going to be at work during this 10th plague. And in these 7 verses, and perhaps one of the cruelest things about slavery is that there's an indignity suffered by the slaves, for example, not being able to protect their children. They're sold as property by the slave owners. So it's a very crushing sort of thing to people who live with this all the time. So protecting children is in the picture here, and the slaves aren't able to do it. Likewise, the Egyptians had the Hebrews had their firstborns killed by the Egyptians by throwing into the Nile, right? We remember that too. So now, after slaves can't protect their children, after the Egyptians kill the Hebrew firstborns by throwing them into the Nile, here is going to be an act of measure for measure. the Egyptians are going to have their firstborns killed. Okay, chapter 12. This starts a whole new sort of Torah, or change in the focus, switching from mostly narrative to mostly law. And it goes through chapter 13. So chapters 12 and 13 are kind of this hard left we took in the midst of this story, which is, by the way, reaching its dramatic height, right? It's peak interest. What's going to happen? How's this going to happen? If you didn't know this story, where it was going, you'd be on the edge of your seat wondering what's going on. And right in the midst of that, it breaks off into this discussion of the law and so on and so forth. So why is it doing that? Well, it is an interlude. It may be just a kind of a break with virtually no import other than hold you on a little bit. Another possibility is that God is thinking or saying, before I take you out of Egypt, I want you to understand these things, which is what he talks about in 12 and 13. The point that he will ultimately try to make is that you Jews will have to do something for your freedom. Just surviving is not good enough. So here in chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, and goes on to describe various laws and processes and what Passover is about and what to do, and unleavened bread. Be dressed, be ready. In other words, be ready to go when you have that Paschal meal. Have your rods ready. I mean, really, be ready. This is going to happen fast. So in chapter 12, this is clear down at verse 14. This day shall be to you one of remembrance. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord throughout the ages. You shall celebrate it as an institution for all time. The obligation to remember the Passover is a permanent law. And it's the first of many that characterize what you and I might refer to as common, or not common, distinctive Jewish way of life. The word Pesach, I'm not quite sure if I'm pronouncing it right, Pasach, P-A-S-A-C-H is how it's transliterated, means Passover, and that's what's about to happen here. The putting of the lamb's blood on the door and the angel of the Lord passing over, that stuff. And the Jews are being told to remember this. And that word, Pesach, is the root for practically every other language is named for Easter. It sounds something like, in all these other languages, something like Pesach. Only for some reason in English is it called Easter. And Prager didn't have an answer, and I couldn't find one either of what word that might be from. But a good likelihood is that it's from some pagan holiday that's called something that sounds like that. I mean, after all, a lot of the holidays started out as some kind of somebody else's holiday for something. Okay, moving on here. So, in continuing the description of what to do at Passover, God said, or I think it's Moses now talking for God, I'm not sure which. In verse 22, take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and apply some of the blood that is in the lintel and to the 2 doorposts. None of you shall go outside the door of his house until morning. So the lintel, of course, is the board across the top of the door. I didn't know that till I read this. It's not a common word. Like, wow, you see the neighbor's new lintel? That's really cool. I just didn't think of that. But the important thing here is how radical this business was of God telling the Israelites to go get a lamb or a goat, make sure it's the best one, slaughter it, cook it, eat it, and then on top of all that, smear its blood on the doorpost. What you need to realize is that the lamb/goat was an Egyptian god. The act of doing any of these, let alone all of these things, would have been abhorrent to Egyptians. Capital punishment kind of crime. Back in verse 6, the Jews are told to watch over the lamb or goat for 3 days. Another huge risk of being seen, having a lamb or goat bleating away that Egyptians could listen to. One thing to understand here, this is something of a test of the Hebrews. Would they risk being stoned, or however capital punishment was meted out? Would they risk being stoned to obey their own God? It also helps remove psychological barriers to freedom. Slaves develop over time, and it's been 400 years, so there's been plenty of time. Slaves develop a slavery kind of mentality. Unfortunately, whether this was this particular part of the Passover story was intended to de-enslave the mentality of the Jews, it didn't really work. They never really got over their slave mentality. And God recognized that and ultimately did not let this first generation in the wilderness enter into the promised land. They never did get de-enslaved. That blood over the door, though, just to drive a point home, any Egyptian walking by and seeing this over a door, it sort of in neon light says, "I have slaughtered your God and eaten it." And there probably were Jews in the midst or in the group that didn't do this. I mean, think how scary that would be. Talk about poking a wasp's nest with a stick. You would be agitating the people who, at least up till this point, are still in control, and not just agitating. It's pretty much a pound on the desk kind of threat. So still in chapter 12, verse 26, and when your children ask you, what do you mean by this rite? God instructs the Jews to teach their children about the Exodus. That's what the Passover period is all about. That's what the Passover Seder in particular is all about. The picture on the screen is a picture of a Seder, which is a Jewish meal with a lot of ritual that teaches kids about the bitter herbs and the salt water and this and that. I remember doing one in college, and it was a Jewish friend took me to the college Seder for the Jewish community there, and I was pretty touched and pretty impressed and pretty amazed at what I learned by doing that. If you ever get a chance to go to a Seder, I would highly encourage it. But the bigger picture reason is the Torah, the whole thing about the Torah is to teach people. The word Torah does not mean law. In the churches I grew up with, the Torah was often referred to as the first 5 books of the law. That's really not quite accurate. The word Torah in Hebrew means teacher or teaching. So it's really the first 5 books of the teachings of God. And what he wants you to know, what wisdom he wants to impart, what rules he wants you to realize you're under, etc. Another interesting thing about Jewish religion and the teaching of children is that they're taught to ask questions. At a Seder or an event like this, it's various questions that they're supposed to ask. Hang on just a second. I'm going to turn the sound down over here in case it's bothering us. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay. And during the course of the questioning, God tells the adults via the Torah how to answer, or at least get things started. The point of the Exodus, or the time of the Exodus, is, remember, very very new in the life of the Israelite nation. The Israelites themselves were basically children when it came to understanding God and being Jewish and so on. And in fact, the Torah refers to them as the children of the Torah. Still in chapter 12, verse 49, there shall be one law for the citizen and for the stranger who dwells among you. This is one of the first laws that the Israelites were given as they left Egypt. And unlike most other nations that have no protections at all for strangers, here's a law equating member and stranger. There is only one law for members and for strangers. This is unique in ancient Near East, and presumably the world, as best Prager could research anyway. So now we're in chapter 14. We've hopped back into now the dramatic story as things are shaping up. The Hebrews have been sent out. Basically, Pharaoh chased them out, beat off. But then I guess Pharaoh had second thoughts. And the Hebrew here in 6 says, he ordered his chariot and took his men with him. This is when they're going to give chase to the Israelites, who are now somewhere on their way. They're out of Egypt and they're on their way to someplace in the wilderness, presumably a fair distance from Egypt, or at least where the Pharaoh lived. But the Pharaoh's going to catch up to him. One thing of interest here, the word ordered, what's translated here as ordered, in the Hebrew really means hitched. So it means Pharaoh, hitched his chariot himself, which would have been odd. Normally, of course, he would have servants do it or something. But this may have been an indication of timeliness. He decided this was not a good idea to let him go, and he wanted to get out after him right now. He was very anxious to get going. He hitched up the horses himself rather than wait for servants. And just a sort of a fine point about the chariots. Archaeological evidence suggests that chariots were invented not much before this event. So chariots would have been, quote unquote, the most advanced military weapon of the time. So 14:10, as Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites caught sight of the Egyptians advancing upon them. Greatly frightened, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. Remember those fickle children, the Israelites, who didn't know quite how to be a slave and be free and be slave and be free? It was just 2 verses earlier in this chapter that they were defiantly leaving Egypt. Now they cower. They really do not have yet a very sophisticated appreciation or understanding of what God is all about, or even perhaps who he is. This is understandable, though, after centuries of servitude. That slave mentality I talked about earlier is very hard to break. It's a real problem. And again, this may be why God let this generation die off before entering the Holy Land. God realized that they would not have the gumption to fight the Canaanites, which is going to come along later on in the stories. They weren't ready for the burdens of responsibility of freedom. They even claimed later that they'd rather return to Egypt and be taken care of than die in the wilderness. This reminded Prager of phrases back during the Cold War. Is it better red than dead, or better dead than red? Did I say that too fast? Some thought it was better red than dead. Others thought it was better dead than red. And like most everything in life, it's a choice. So, verse 21, then Moses held out his arm over the sea, and the Lord drove back the sea with a strong east wind all that night, and turned the sea into dry ground. The waters were split. The first question here, why a wind? You'd think we'd already put an end to the pagan gods back in Egypt with the first 9 plagues, but not necessarily. God is using nature here to drive home, some final driving home of the point that nature is not a god. God controls nature. Nature is not a god of its own. This sort of thing, interestingly enough, if you think of it rationally or logically, it also allows room for the skeptic. It's, did nature do that, or did God do that? Maybe, you've heard people talk about, well, there's evidence of this happening, and sometimes the winds can come from 2 different directions, and blah, blah, blah. It allows room for a skeptic, someone who can decide, I think it was just, if it happened at all, it was just a happenstance of nature. This is God's general approach in the whole Torah. There is never sort of what you might call rock solid evidence, or at least not a preponderance of it, to claim that, yep, that's God, he exists, he's faithful, he's moral, blah, blah, blah. God wants humans to be free to choose rather than compelled through any kind of incontrovertible evidence. Verse 27, Moses held out his arm over the sea, and at daybreak the sea returned to its normal state, and the Egyptians fled at its approach. But the Lord hurled the Egyptians into the sea, crushing the Egyptians done at a time of day when the Hebrews could see it. They needed to see their oppressors destroyed. It's part of the de-enslaving mentality breakdown, you might say, or at least an attempt to break down that slave mentality. 15:1. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. They said, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. And in the Talmud, which is the collection of rabbinic and commentators on the Old Testament throughout Jewish history, practically. In the Talmud, it's also agreed upon, or often suggests, angels sang with him too. But God rebuked the angels for rejoicing in the death of his creatures, the Egyptians. They were his creatures. But he did not rebuke Moses and the Israelites for singing. It had to have been overwhelming relief for them. Maybe it was a victory for morality. Not so much about the Egyptians per se, but rather the victory over evil. One of the lessons here, perhaps one should not celebrate the fall of one's enemy. That's not the proper thing to celebrate. The proper thing to celebrate is the fall of evil. I mean, we all recognize that even soldiers on the evil side left behind families, loved ones, great friends. Their progeny were snuffed out the minute they were snuffed out. But you do ultimately get back to the bottom line, though. If no Egyptians had been killed, just like if no Nazi soldiers had been killed, the Jews would never have been freed. So later in chapter 15, this is verse 22, then Moses caused Israel to set out from the Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea. They went on into the wilderness of Shur. They traveled 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. This is the first of 4 crises in the wilderness that the Israelites encounter. Now, and by the way, I don't know where this came into the discussion from Prager's books and listening to his lectures and stuff. But it had never dawned on me that there were other people in this group that were not Jews or not Israelites. And it's in some verse somewhere, I don't remember exactly, it's described that multitudes left Egypt in this great Moses-led triumphant exit, so to speak. Not all of whom were Jews. There were some Egyptians, there were some who knows what, Midianites, whatever. So we shouldn't assume all along here. In fact, we shouldn't assume that they're all Jews. In fact, we should assume that they're a mixed bunch. Probably most of them were Israelites, but certainly not all. So anyway, just thought I'd throw that out before I forget to say it again. Four different crises in the wilderness. First, there's no food. Then there's first there's no water. Then there's no food. Then there's no water again. And then they're attacked by a desert tribe. Their survival was very precarious, and clearly only by God's providence did they survive this. Were they taken care of? Which may explain to some degree why God didn't get too upset with them when they did a lot of complaining, which, as you recall in the story, they were kind of complaining all the time to God about this, that, and the other. But this story does point to the notion of ingratitude and lack of faith. It's very difficult to develop a serious sense of faith if you don't remember to be grateful for what your faith is focused on. In this case, God. If you don't remember what God has done for you, if you're not grateful by remembering what God has done for you, it's very hard to keep keep some sort of faith. And it's very common. You see it in human nature all the time, right? Most people complain far more than they praise. Most people will register complaints far more often than they offer thanks or praise to someone. So jot down a little note to yourself to write somebody a thank you note at some company next time they do something nice for you. In verse 26, he said, "If you will heed the Lord your God diligently, doing what is upright in his sight, giving ear to his commandments, and keeping all his laws, then I will not bring upon you any of the diseases that I brought upon the Egyptians. For I, the Lord, am your healer." So this is a covenant. If you do, I will. But sometimes we get carried away understanding what the covenant actually means. Some would like to think that God is guaranteeing protection from all illnesses here, assuming that you stay upright in his sight and heed his commandments and all that. That's not what it says. The only protection that he's offering here is protection from what he brought upon the Egyptians, the diseases, the 10 plagues. That's all he's promising here. It's obvious that God does not protect religious people from illness, or good people from illness for that matter, or anybody from illness or accident or natural disaster or what have you. I mean, just look around you. You know, we all know people who are good, decent, religious people who have had sickness or death or tragedy or one bad thing or another. Some people point to this to show that God has a special or holds Jews to a higher, some sort of superiority. But that's just not true. The Torah goes out of its way to make it clear that that the sense of chosen has nothing to do with superiority. In fact, it's more problematic for the Jews to be chosen than it is good in a sense. They were chosen to have a mission to go out into the world and share the Torah, share God's teaching. And in terms of holding up that teaching, God actually holds the Jews to a higher standard than he holds anyone else. So it's like somebody, the Prager reference, put it. Yeah, God told us we had a mission. He just didn't tell us it was a suicide mission. At the beginning of chapter 16, the Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, when we ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to starve this whole congregation to death." This is one of those complaining things that I mentioned just a few slides ago. This was not uncommon, this kind of complaining when the Israelites were out in the wilderness. This gets us to another problem with human nature. You have kind of two choices when it comes to being in a nation and what you want your nation or leader or God or whoever to do for you. You can choose liberty or freedom, however you want to put it, / responsibilities of your own, or you can ask to be taken care of, basically. Back in Egypt, these people didn't have to provide for themselves. They were fed, quote unquote, however much they were fed and watered, and as long as they worked and all that sort of thing, they were basically taken care of. Now they're free, and they're going to have to start behaving like adults, so to speak, who are free and therefore have the responsibilities upon themselves. They are accountable to themselves for how their lives is handled. In human nature, people do not yearn to be free. Freedom or liberty is a value. What people naturally yearn for is to be taken care of. And it's a problem. So here's the story of the manna. In chapter 16, a whole bunch of verses there, 4 through 36. The Lord said to Moses, this is where it starts in 4. I will rain down bread for you from the sky, and the people shall go out and gather each day that day's portion, that I may thus test them, to see whether they will follow my instructions or not. God literally nursed his people for 40 years out in the wilderness. And an interesting thing about this manna, the manna only came down in daily chunks, and they were only supposed to take enough for each individual person. In fact, that's all that was provided. But on the 6th day, double portions fell or were available in the morning, or however it worked out. And which is interesting. A couple of things. That is so that on the 7th day, the Sabbath, they could rest and did not have to collect food from the ground. It was also one of those anti-nature things. Something that happens 6 out of 7 days is not natural. The sun rises every day. What happens in nature is much more regular than this. This is odd. During this time, Moses has to remind his people all the time that it's God that's providing all this, not he or his brother Aaron. He does slip. Moses is human after all. By later taking credit, but ultimately God punishes him for his failings by not letting him into the promised land. He got angry. Moses did sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not. Like I said, poor guy's human. So chapter 17 is basically a very short little chapter about Amalek and the Amalekinites, or is that however you say it, who come and fought with Israel at Rephidim. This is the attack on the Israelites in the wilderness that I mentioned earlier. So Joshua goes out to defend the Israelites from Amalek. And there's an interesting, it's kind of a weird story, actually. Or it struck me as weird anyway. During the battle, Moses is not there during the battle, but during the battle, whenever Moses raises his rod, the Israelites are supported and they start winning the battle. But as the battle continued, Moses got more weary, and his arms started to lower. And as he lowered his rod from the sky, the tide of the battle would turn and start favoring the Amalek side. So the Israelites who are back in camp or off to the side where Moses is, they prop him up with stones in order to get the rod back up into the air. And ultimately the Israelites prevail. So what's going on here? What's the lesson? What are we supposed to get out of this? Was it really Moses' action? Probably not. Was it just plain divine interaction or intervention? Maybe. That's a rational possibility. Another thought that Prager offered in the book is perhaps it's more when Moses had his rod in the air. You're going to have to kind of picture this. The Israelites would be watching it, and they would be looking up to the sky, looking up to God. And maybe that's ultimately the connection that God wanted to make, that when you look up to me, when you count on me, when you have faith in my faithfulness, then good things happen. So later on in 17, verse 14, then the Lord said to Moses, inscribe this in a document as a reminder and read it aloud to Joshua. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. So obviously Amalek was pretty evil. God was not happy with him at all. And he's telling the guys here, that's the question. What is he telling them here? This is a document. Inscribe this in a document as a reminder and read it out loud. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. So which is it? Is he supposed to be remembered? Or is he supposed to be blotted from memory? And Prager's thought at this point is consistent with what he usually, or how he usually handles ambiguities, or what appears to be conflicts. Usually it means both. Remember there was some words that, a Hebrew word that could be translated either way. It may end up meaning that you need to be aware of both meanings. Here, do you remember or do you forget? And Prager suggests, well, actually, the answer is you do both. Not exactly the same things at both sides, but both. You remember the great evil that was done, and the lessons that you learned, and who was a problem and who wasn't, blah, blah, blah. You remember the great evil, but you forget the evildoers' names. He told the story in lectures, I think it was, the Oklahoma City bombing. Prager was outraged when he saw a picture of the bomber on the cover of Time or Newsweek or some magazine. And he said, we need to remember the great evil, but we need to forget, give no credit or accolades or publicity or whatever word you want to use to the actual evildoers and their names. So, chapter 18. This starts on a whole new section of the Torah, actually. And Jethro is so important that there's only 4 of these sections, I think it is, in the Torah. Jethro is a Midian. He's a Midianite. He's Moses' father-in-law, as the verse indicates. It gets to be funny, actually. Every time he is referred to as Moses' father-in-law, even if his name isn't there. But I don't know how many times Moses' father-in-law, Moses' father-in-law. It gets funny actually after a while, actually. But that's how important the title was to the Torah. He was non-Jewish. He was a Midianite. And this is another example of a non-Jew in the Torah becoming a hero. To the extent that 1 of 4 sections in the Torah are named after him. They would say, turn to the Jethro section of the Torah, and all the Jews would know what that means. I guess it starts around chapter 18 or something. I don't somewhere. It is. In fact, 3 of the 4 sections are named after non-Jews. So it's pretty clear that this is a book for the world, not just a book for the Jews. Jethro is a good man. God recognizes that. And Jethro recognizes one God. He's probably pagan. It says, I think it said earlier that he's a Midianite priest. So he's definitely a pagan of some sort. And throughout the whole purpose of this book here, this chapter, is that Jethro is giving Moses advice about how to deal with the people. And it's great advice. And Moses just accepts it with great humility. He doesn't argue. He says, basically, yep, that's a good idea. And he goes out and does it. 18:10. This is still the Jethro chapter here, as it were. Blessed be the Lord, Jethro said, who delivered you from the Egyptians and from Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. This blessed be the Lord is an interesting phrase, particularly coming from Jethro, who we just learned is not a Jew. In Hebrew, that phrase is Baruch Hashem. Blessed be the Lord. And it's probably one of the most common Jewish expressions. You can walk up to a Jew and say, how are you? And they'll reply, Baruch Hashem. It's kind of like our praise the Lord or thank God or something like that. It flows off the tongue very easily. And here it's coming from a Midianite pagan, not even a Hebrew. And the Jewish community uses his phrase over and over and over. It's said 2 other times in the Torah, by the way, Baruch Hashem, once by Noah and once by Abraham's servant, both of whom were also not Jewish. It just floors me, all the interesting ins and outs of this stuff. He goes on to, after this verse, he goes on to tell Moses that if he keeps handling all the problems with people himself, he's going to tire out. And what he really needs to do is set up sort of a court system. He selects some judges, priests, I think he called them, and have them deal with the day-to-day problems. You can be sort of the Supreme Court if something comes along that's so big or difficult or complicated that you can handle. We'll let your sub-priests, so to speak, handle that. And he describes what the requirements are for these judges, what he calls priests. A, they have to be strong and capable. 2, they have to be God-fearing. 3, they have to be men of truth. And 4, they have to hate ill-gotten gain. In other words, be incorruptible. Prager points out what's missing from that list. And it's not, Prager's point is that it should be missing. what's missing that most people would think would be required is compassion. But in the strictest sense of both compassion and justice, compassion tends to subvert justice. At the personal level, it's admirable, but at a societal level, compassion actually does injustice to justice. So anyway, Jethro tells Moses all this, how to set it up, and Moses says, "Okay, good idea. Thank you. 19:4, probably one of the most familiar thoughts in Christianity anyway, and indeed Jewish world too to some degree. 19:4, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. This is God speaking. And this is a very rare instance in the Torah of God speaking poetically. Two parts here. First, God's existence. You saw me do this. And then second, and that's in the first part. And then second, God's love. That he would carry you on eagle's wings and bring you to him, capital H in him. Both make perfect sense. How else could this world have been made? And how could an uncaring God create caring people? It's also, by the way, I thought I'd point out, knowing hymns and choir anthems and such of the church. The eagle's wing theme is very popular. There's a hymn about it. A lot of anthems are written about it. And if you didn't understand why that was important, eagles put babies on their backs or wings because they fly higher than any other bird. So the baby is most protected, even if something wants to get at the eagle from below. Other birds keep their young in between their legs because attack birds are likely to come from above. Even if an arrow is shot at the eagle from the ground, with the bird on its back, the baby on its back, mom will take the arrow first. It's a very poetic and very rare in the Bible for God to be poetic like this. 19:5. Now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. This is sort of when God nails down the you are chosen, you are my chosen people kind of sentiment. What's often overlooked here is the third word of this verse, if. This agreement, this covenant, is conditional. Hosea later teaches that God will take people back if they're penitent, but that doesn't contradict this. You got to remember, God of the Torah is obsessed with people doing good and not doing evil. And he is equally obsessed with justice. So if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession or my chosen people. A lot comes with that. (19:6), but you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This, Prager had a very interesting take on it. Just like societies need people doing all kinds of tasks, the world needs groups of people focusing on particular tasks. And God has assigned here to the Jews to be the world's priests. That is why the Jews are chosen. They're not in any way better. They have a mission. And if they don't follow God's laws themselves, they too will be punished. They are not any better than anybody else in that regard. Calling people to be holy is a Torah original. And sending people out to teach others how to be holy or good is also a Torah original. This is not the kind of study, this being holy is not the kind of study like monks do, going off into what do you call it, when you're all by yourself. The word escapes me. But that doesn't count. It's perfectly good and required to some degree to be studying the Torah. But what you really need to be doing is to get out among the people and teach them what God wants of them and how to do it. Doing food banks and all that wonderful stuff, giving to charities, is also not enough. You need to proselytize. Prager, being a devout Jew, is overly complimentary in a genuine way of Christians. He said if it wasn't for the Christians and their effort to evangelize, nowhere near the number of people in the world would know what the Old Testament, let alone the Torah, is about, because the Christians, quote unquote, dragged it along with them as they were going out. I was trying to think, well, I wonder if there's anybody else even better. I thought, well, the Mormons are always out there pushing, proselytizing, evangelizing. So maybe they've done even better than the rest of the Christians. And then chapter 19 ends with some further instructions from God. We're not going to go over them, about telling the people to stay at the base of Mount Sinai. Don't go any closer. And this sets us up now for next week's, which is the last week, grand finale in my mind. I mean, just what really got me started on this was studying the Ten Commandments. And that's what we get to tackle, at least for an hour, next week. We are not going to be able to do it nearly the justice that Prager does, either in the book or in his lectures. But we will have fun with it nonetheless. Speaking of Prager's lectures, I was sharing this with Karen earlier, and I'll share with everybody who's here and who watches the recording. Listening to Prager's lectures on these topics adds an unbelievable amount of richness, deepness, sidebars. If you thought what was in the book was interesting, eye-opening, oh my gosh, I never thought of that, you will be amazed by the lectures, because there's actually so much more to it. But here's the kicker: they cost money. You can join the Pragertopia, is what he calls the area where you pay for stuff. It costs $120 a year. But there's lots more content. The entire lecture series, all the way from the Genesis 1 to the end of Deuteronomy, the whole Torah, it's like 240 hours of lecture is there for you to listen to. It's audio recording. And there's all kinds of other stuff too. Podcasts of his radio show, best of, other courses, other talks, blah, blah, blah. And for our purposes and for the current situation, it's the only way to hear what Prager has to say about the remaining 3 books of the Torah. Genesis and Exodus are the only 2 books that are actually published. His lectures on the last 3 are the only thing that's available to get at what he wants to talk about. I understand Leviticus is the book of Leviticus. His Rational Bible is coming out next spring, but they come out pretty slowly. So I have an offer. I'm going to offer you a guarantee. You paid $120 and listen to at least one group of lectures. And if you look on the screen, you can. This is one group. It's chapters 16 through 20. It's in 4 different lectures, each about 90 minutes long. So what is that? 6 hours. 6 hours of lecture just to cover chapters 16 through 20 in Exodus, which happens to be what we were looking at tonight. So you pay the $120, you get access to all his stuff for a year. If you listen to at least one of these groups, which is usually about 4 lectures, and if you're not fired up in some way about what you hear, you let me know and I will send you a check for $120. That's how much this has meant to me. That's how much I think it can mean to you to offer that. Now, this is a limited offer. It's only for First United Methodist Church of Rio Grande folks or personal friends of mine. I wish I could open it up to everybody in the world, but I can't take that much risk financially. Sorry. Because this could be seen, listened to, now that it will be recorded and on the internet. Anybody can see this, so I'm not offering this to just anybody. But And just so you know for sure, I won't let it go unsaid. I don't make any money or anything else on what you buy from Prager or don't buy. I'm not pushing any kind of business here for myself. That's for sure. I guess I'm pushing Prager's business, but that's okay by me. So there you go. Hope you understood that. If you have any questions, you can always ask. So lastly, I have some homework for you to do for next time. 4 things basically. One is watch a 5-minute video. It's called Do Not Steal. Dennis Prager does it. It's a very fascinating take on that one commandment, do not steal. It only takes 5 minutes to watch the video, and there's a link to it on the God is Good webpage on the church website. So go there, listen to that, watch and listen to that 5-minute video. The rest of the assignment is to think about. You're not going to have to turn in an essay or a paper. It's nothing like that. But here's a couple of things to think about to get your juices flowing about the 10 Commandments. The opening verse of the section of the 10 Commandments is, number 2 there, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Here's what I want you to think about. 2a. Is this a commandment? It is in some list. I'll just tell you now, it is in some people's list, and not in others as to whether or not it's a commandment or not. So what do you think? Is this a commandment? Secondly, if so, what is it commanding? And C, is it a commandment to believe in God? It's sort of a possible answer to 2D. Is it a commandment to believe in God? Think about that. Okay, number 3. Why does God refer to himself as a liberator rather than the creator of the world in this opening phrase, who brought you out of Egypt? He could have said who created the heavens and the earth, but he didn't. He said, brought you out of Egypt. Why? Which would be more compelling to you? I who brought you out of Egypt, or I who created the heavens and the earth and everything and you and so on? And then lastly, why did God describe Egypt as a land of slavery in that verse right up above there, number 2? I mean, after all, wouldn't they know that? Why did God have to describe it that way? So there's your assignments, and we will see you for the next session, the 10 Commandments, on October 6th. Same bat station, same bat channel. There's a reminder again to watch that 5-minute video. And by the way, I put those questions and all that whole assignment info is also on the webpage, God is Good, at the church website. So let me see here. Let me turn stuff back on here. See if anybody has any immediate questions. Okay, I think if you want to ask or comment anything here at this point, you can. Anything?
Thank you, Jamie.
Hey, you're very welcome. Karen, kind of overwhelming, isn't it? Okay, very good. Well, we will see you all on the 6th. Have a good time till then, and enjoy diving into this stuff.
Good night.
Good night.